Somewhere in your kitchen right now, there is almost certainly a package of barley hiding in plain sight, and you probably have no idea it is there. Not on the label, not in the marketing. Buried 3 ingredients deep in your beer, your whiskey, your breakfast cereal, even the malt vinegar on your fish and chips, sits a grain that once ruled the ancient world so completely that entire civilizations measured wealth, wages, and justice in bushels of it. Today, it cannot even win top billing on its own beer bottle. So, what happened? How does a crop that outranked wheat for most of human history end up demoted to a footnote, a supporting ingredient, an afterthought stocked on the bottom shelf of the grain aisle? The answer involves sacred rituals in Mesopotamian temples, laws carved in stone that used grain rations as a tool of state control, Roman generals who used it to humiliate their own soldiers, and industrial tycoons who quietly built beer and whiskey empires on its back while letting other crops take the glory. Barley did not fade away by accident. It was pushed, rebranded, taxed, prohibited, and eventually rendered invisible by forces far bigger than any harvest. This is the story of how the grain that built the first cities of civilization became the grain nobody remembers, and why, if you look closely enough, it never actually left. It just learned to disappear into everything else. Long before it was money, before it was law, before it was rationed out to soldiers and stigmatized as animal feed, barley was simply a wild grass swaying on a hillside, and somebody somewhere decided it was worth picking. Around 10,000 years ago, small bands of foragers in the hill country of the ancient Near East began gathering the seed heads of a scraggly, drought-tolerant grass we now call wild barley. It was not an obvious candidate for greatness. The grains were small, the husks tough, the yield unpredictable. But barley had one advantage that mattered more than taste or abundance. It grew almost anywhere. In poor soil, in salty soil, in the punishing heat of a Near Eastern summer, where other plants simply gave up. That toughness is the entire reason this story exists at all. A more delicate grain would have stayed wild and forgettable. Barley, stubborn and unglamorous, got domesticated instead. Early communities began deliberately planting and harvesting it, favoring the plants whose seed heads stayed intact long enough to be gathered rather than shattering and scattering on the wind. Over generations, without anyone understanding a single principle of genetics, human hands quietly rewrote the plant's biology simply by choosing, year after year, which seeds got to become next year's crop. That is domestication in its rawest form, not a eureka moment, but thousands of small, repeated choices compounding into an entirely new relationship between humans and grass. And then, almost certainly by accident, something else happened. Grain left damp too long, or stored in a container that let in wild yeast, would ferment. The result was a thick, cloudy, mildly intoxicating liquid, bitter and strange, and utterly unlike anything a hunter-gatherer would have deliberately set out to invent. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to brew beer. Somebody almost certainly drank the fermented sludge of an accident, felt the unmistakable buzz that follows, and told their neighbors. Word travels fast when the news is that your leftovers can make you feel like a god. And that is precisely how early societies treated it. Long before barley was feeding armies or backing currencies, it was feeding gods, or at least the priests who claimed to speak for them. Fermented barley drinks show up in the earliest religious and ceremonial contexts we can find, poured out as offerings, shared in communal rites, used to mark harvests, funerals, and festivals, with a substance that made the ordinary world feel briefly transformed. Beer, in this earliest incarnation, was not a commodity. It was closer to a sacrament, a technology for altering consciousness that priestly classes quickly recognized as useful for cementing their own authority. If you control the ritual, and the ritual requires grain, you have just given yourself enormous social leverage over everyone who wants access to the ritual. This is the quiet, easily overlooked hinge point of the entire story. Barley did not begin as bread. It did not begin as a staple food at all. It began as a sacred substance, brewed, offered, and consumed in contexts dripping with religious meaning. Centuries before anyone thought to grind it into flour for the dinner table. Only later would it graduate from altar to table, from ritual object to rationed necessity, and eventually from necessity to the literal unit of value that entire economies would be built on. But that transformation required something beer alone could never provide: bureaucracy. And bureaucracy, as it turns out, was about to fall in love with barley. By 3000 BC, in the flat, sun-baked river valleys of Sumer, barley had left the temple and entered the ledger. This is where the story stops being about gods and starts being about accounting, which, if we are honest, is where most great empires actually begin. The Sumerians did not have coins. They had grain, and grain became the measuring stick against which everything else was valued. A worker's daily wage was calculated in barley. A debt was recorded in barley. A dowry, a rent payment, a tax obligation, all of it denominated in the same dusty commodity that farmers hauled in from the fields every season. Clay tablets recovered from sites across Mesopotamia, inscribed in cuneiform by professional scribes, list barley rations distributed to laborers building temples and canals. An entire administrative class devoted to nothing but tracking who received how much grain and when. Picture one of these scribes, seated cross-legged in the shade of a mud-brick storehouse, stylus in hand, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay to record that a given crew of canal diggers received their allotment for the month. He is not a poet. He is not a priest. He is something new in human history, a bureaucrat, and his entire job exists because barley needed to be counted, stored, and distributed on a scale no informal system could manage. This is the moment grain stopped being merely sacred and became administrative, which is a less romantic word for the same underlying fact, that whoever controls the barley controls the people who eat it. Centuries later, in Babylon, this logic hardened into law. The Code of Hammurabi, carved in stone around 1754 BCE, explicitly references grain rations as a standard for wages and payments, barley functioning as both currency and unit of measurement in a legal system that left remarkably little to interpretation. Hammurabi, the Babylonian king, who styled himself a shepherd of his people, understood something every ruler after him would rediscover: control the food supply, and you control behavior far more effectively than any army could manage alone. Ration the grain generously, and workers stay loyal. Ration it poorly, and you invite revolt. This is the state weaponizing agriculture, dressing coercion up as order, stability, and the rule of law. It is worth pausing here, because this is not a metaphor. Barley was, quite literally, money in a world before coins existed to compete with it. Wages were paid in it, fines were levied in it, surpluses were stored in vast state granaries as a hedge against famine, drought, and the perennial threat of a population that might, if hungry enough, stop cooperating altogether. The grain that began as a gift to the gods had become the currency of kings, and the humble scribe with his stylus and clay tablet had become just as essential to civilization as the farmer sowing the seed. Which raises an obvious question, one that popular history loves to answer with a tidy, romantic story about beer driving the entire agricultural revolution. That story is coming next. It is a good story. It is also largely wrong. So here is the story you have probably heard. The one that gets repeated at dinner parties by people who read one article and decided it was settled science. Beer, the legend goes, came before bread. Not just chronologically, but causally. Humans, the theory suggests, did not domesticate wild grasses because they wanted to bake a loaf. They did it because they wanted to get drunk, and everything else, agriculture, permanent settlements, civilization itself, was just a happy accident that followed from that first thirsty impulse. It is a wonderful story. It flatters us. It suggests that the entire architecture of human civilization was built not on patient, calculated planning, but on the same impulse that drives a college student to microwave a burrito at 2 a.m. Unfortunately, the archaeological record is considerably less fun than the legend. What the evidence actually shows is messier, slower, and far less cinematic. Early foraging communities were almost certainly processing wild barley for food, in the form of ground meal and parched grains. At the same time, they were experimenting with fermentation, not in some clean sequence where drinking preceded eating. Grain does not sit conveniently in one category or another. A damp storage pit that produces an accidental ferment could just as easily be sitting next to a grinding stone, producing flour for porridge. The two uses were probably developing side by side, tangled together, indistinguishable in the archaeological layers we now pick through centuries later, trying to assign a tidy narrative to what was, in reality, a slow, overlapping, trial-and-error relationship between humans and a useful plant. This is the part nobody wants to hear, because it robs the story of its punchline. There was no light bulb moment, no single forager standing over a fermenting pot, having an epiphany that changed the course of history. There was, instead, thousands of years of small, unglamorous adjustments in food processing, storage, and cultivation, occurring in parallel, driven by nutrition and survival at least as much as by ritual or intoxication. The beer before bread hypothesis persists not because the evidence overwhelmingly supports it, but because it is a better story than the truth. And better stories tend to survive longer than accurate ones, particularly when they get repeated in documentaries with dramatic music and shots of foaming clay vessels. None of this means the ritual use of fermented barley was unimportant. It clearly mattered enormously, as we have already seen, in offerings, festivals, and the construction of religious and political authority. But mattering enormously and single-handedly causing the invention of agriculture are two very different claims, and the second one does not survive contact with the actual dirt archaeologists have spent decades sifting through. The honest version of the story is less quotable. Early humans were hungry, resourceful, and endlessly experimental, with a plant that fed them, intoxicated them, and eventually financed empires, sometimes in that order, sometimes not, and mostly all at once. Which is, if you think about it, a far more human story than the myth ever was. Move the story forward 1,000 years, and barley has gone from sacred offering to imperial infrastructure, the single most important input, keeping the largest fighting force on Earth marching, digging, and building roads. The Roman army ran on grain, the way modern militaries run on fuel, and barley was very often that grain, cheaper to grow than wheat, more tolerant of poor soil, and available in the volume an empire needed to feed tens of thousands of men at once. But barley in the Roman world carried a strange double identity, because the same grain that filled a soldier's ration sack could also be used to humiliate him. Roman military discipline included a punishment known to historians through the writings of authors like Polybius, in which legionaries who broke ranks, showed cowardice, or failed in their duty had their wheat rations stripped away and replaced with barley alone. Wheat was the reward. Barley was the demotion, a visible, edible mark of shame handed out in front of the entire unit, because in the strict social hierarchy of Roman food, barley sat below wheat, despite being the more dependable crop. Think about that for a second. The grain sturdy enough to survive drought, poor soil, and bad weather, when wheat simply could not, was treated, socially, as an inferior food, fit for punishment, animals, and the poor. It is one of history's more quietly absurd inversions, the plant doing the more essential job while carrying the lower status, a pattern that, as we will see, barley never fully escapes. This stigma was not confined to the ranks. Roman gladiators training for combat were sometimes referred to, half-mockingly, as hordeiri, barley eaters, a nickname referencing the barley-heavy diet fed to fighters, meant to bulk them up before combat. The irony again cuts both ways. The men whose survival depended on strength and endurance were sustained by the grain the culture around them treated as low status, the food of soldiers in disgrace, of animals, of the poor who had no wheat to fall back on. And yet without it, the legions do not march, the walls do not get built, and the empire does not hold together long enough to leave the roads, aqueducts, and law codes we still study today. Barley, in classical antiquity, becomes something we will see repeated again and again across this story. A grain essential enough to be indispensable, but never quite prestigious enough to be respected, feeding the machine while being treated as the food of those who had failed, or those who had no better option. That contradiction, sustenance on one hand, stigma on the other, does not resolve here. It just quietly hardens into cultural habit, one that will follow barley through the next major turn in its story, as an entirely different food hierarchy takes shape across medieval Europe. Rome falls, but the food hierarchy it perfected does not. It simply migrates north, mutates, and settles into the manor houses and monasteries of medieval Europe, where a new class of landowners begins sorting grains the way their Roman predecessors once sorted men. Wheat, delicate, finicky, demanding rich soil and gentle weather, becomes the bread of lords, of bishops, of anyone with the land and labor to coddle it into growing. Barley, tougher, cheaper, and far more forgiving of thin soil and short growing seasons, gets pushed downward into the diet of peasants who could not afford to gamble a harvest on a crop that failed in bad weather. Manorial records from across medieval Europe describe this split plainly: wheat bread for the household of the manor, barley and rye loaves, often coarse, dense, and dark, for the tenants working the fields. The peasant's loaf was not a metaphor. It was policy, baked directly into the class structure of feudal life. And it was heavy, filling, and by most surviving accounts, an acquired taste that most people acquired out of necessity rather than pleasure. But barley did not simply vanish into the background of peasant subsistence. It found a second, quieter kingdom, one that would ultimately outlast the manor system itself, in the tankard. Monasteries across medieval Europe, needing something safer to drink than untreated water, and something to sustain monks through fasting seasons, began brewing ale on an industrial scale for their time. Some records suggesting monastic breweries producing thousands of gallons a year. Ale was not a luxury. It was a caloric lifeline, a source of clean liquid nutrition in a world where water could quietly kill you, and barley, malted and fermented, was its foundation. Villages brewed their own, households brewed their own, and barley, demoted at the dinner table, quietly became indispensable at the drinking table instead. Here is where we pause, because if you are the kind of person who enjoys watching a supposedly humble, forgotten grain reveal itself as the secret architecture behind entire civilizations, that is exactly what this channel does, and hitting subscribe means you will not miss where barley goes next, because it is about to get a great deal stranger. Because while wheat sat at the head of the medieval table, looking prestigious, barley was quietly building something wheat never could: an entire continental drinking culture. Alehouses multiplied. Regional brewing traditions hardened into identity. By the time hops arrive from continental Europe to transform ale into something closer to modern beer, barley's role is no longer just agricultural. It is cultural, economic, and, in ways no medieval peasant could have predicted, about to become industrial. The grain that fed the disgraced Roman soldier and the medieval tenant farmer was, without anyone declaring it so, quietly becoming the backbone of an entire continent's drinking habits. One tankard, one monastery, one village brewhouse at a time. For thousands of years, malting barley, the process of soaking, sprouting and drying grain to unlock its fermentable sugars, was a craft performed by hand, by candlelight, in small batches that rarely left the village that made them. Then, roughly across the 18th and 19th centuries, that entire model was torn apart and rebuilt as an industry. The maltster crouched over his floor of damp grain, turning it by hand shovel every few hours to keep it from overheating, was replaced by machines that could do the same work at a scale no household brewer could have imagined. Pneumatic maltings, mechanical kilns, steam-powered mills, each innovation compressed weeks of patient craft into days of industrial process. Barley did not change. The world around it did. And that change had a face, or rather several, the same archetype recurring across Britain and Ireland, with minor variation: the outsider entrepreneur who saw an entrenched, fragmented, small-scale trade and asked why it could not be bigger, faster, and considerably more profitable. Arthur Guinness, a brewer's son who signed a 9,000-year lease on a small, run-down Dublin brewery in 1759, is the version of this story most people have heard of, though the real transformation was less about any single visionary and more about an entire generation of brewers who realized that barley, once malted and mashed at industrial scale, was no longer a food crop at all. It was a commodity. It could be bought in bulk, shipped by rail and canal, taxed by volume, and turned into a product that traveled the length of an empire without spoiling. Whiskey distilling underwent the identical transformation in Scotland and Ireland, where small pot stills scattered across the countryside, many of them operating illegally to dodge crushing excise duties, gave way over the 19th century to large-scale, legally licensed distilleries, capable of producing spirit by the thousands of gallons rather than the dozens. The continuous still, patented by Ennius Coffey in 1830, allowed distillers to produce a lighter, more consistent spirit far faster than traditional pot stills ever could. And barley, or in some cases barley blended with other cheaper grains, became the industrial fuel for an entire new category of mass-produced whiskey. Think about what that actually meant. A grain once measured out by hand as a laborer's daily wage in Bronze Age ration tablets, once handed to a disgraced Roman soldier as a mark of shame, was now flowing through pipes and pneumatic drums by the ton, feeding breweries and distilleries that shipped their finished product to ports, colonies, and continents their founders would never personally visit. Beer brands became empires in the most literal sense, following British soldiers, administrators, and merchants across the globe, with barley as the uncredited raw material behind every cask. The romantic image of the humble village brewhouse did not vanish overnight, but it was economically doomed the moment mechanized malting proved it could produce more cheaply, and more consistently every single time. Barley had spent 10,000 years as sustenance, ritual object, currency, and peasant staple. Now it had a new identity, industrial commodity, traded on volume and margin, measured in barrels and proof gallons instead of rations and dowries. And with that scale came something else entirely. Enough visible social damage from mass alcohol production that governments, reformers, and moral crusaders could no longer look away. Every empire eventually meets its accountant, and the brewing and distilling empires built on barley were no exception. Once alcohol production scaled into the millions of barrels, it stopped being a private vice and became a public ledger entry. And governments quickly discovered that grain turned into drink could be taxed, tracked, and controlled in ways that grain turned into bread never could. Excise officers became a fixture of the industrial landscape, stationed inside distilleries and breweries to measure output, seal vats, and calculate duty owed before a single cask left the premises. The same barley that had once been counted out in ration tablets by Sumerian scribes was now being counted out again, this time by men with ledgers and government seals, standing between the mash tun and the marketplace. The state had learned that controlling the grain meant controlling the money, and it had no intention of letting either slip through its fingers. But taxation was only half the story. The other half was moral panic, and it arrived with the same energy reformers had once reserved for sin itself. Reports of drunkenness among factory workers, of wages spent in gin shops and ale houses before they ever reached a family table, of accidents on machinery operated by exhausted, intoxicated laborers, gave temperance campaigners the evidence they needed to argue that industrial-scale barley was not feeding nations. It was destroying them. Reformers described the transformation of barley from staple grain to mass-produced spirit as a kind of betrayal, a food source diverted from mouths that needed feeding into bottles that needed selling. The irony sat there in plain sight and mostly went unspoken. Institutions created to safeguard public welfare, to regulate weights, measures, and food supply, increasingly found themselves in the business of deciding how much of a fermented grain product a citizen was permitted to consume, and under what conditions, and at what hour. A grain regulator became, almost by accident, a morality enforcer. Distillers and brewers, for their part, did not surrender their industry quietly. Trade associations lobbied against duties, industry publications downplayed links between mass production and public drunkenness, and some manufacturers actively obscured how much grain diversion was occurring, redirecting barley that might otherwise have gone to bread or feed toward far more profitable spirit production during periods of scarcity. It took insiders willing to break ranks, workers and lower-level managers who understood the actual volumes moving through distillery ledgers, to expose the gap between what the industry claimed publicly and what its production records showed privately. Their testimony fed directly into regulatory hearings, giving lawmakers the ammunition to impose stricter licensing, tighter excise controls, and, in some jurisdictions, outright restrictions on production volume. The grain that had once symbolized divine favor in temple offerings, that had once been sacred enough to pour on altars, was now the subject of parliamentary committees debating permitted proof levels and licensing hours. 10,000 years of ritual reverence had given way to something far less poetic: paperwork. Today, barley has no press agent, no superfood documentaries, no artisanal branding, no farmers' market bundles tied with twine. Roughly 90% of the world's barley crop now goes somewhere you never see it: into livestock feed, fattening the cattle, pigs and poultry that end up on dinner plates under someone else's name. The grain that once measured wages in Babylon, that Roman legions ate as both ration and punishment, that built Guinness's 9,000-year lease and filled the ledgers of coffee's continuous stills, has become an invisible input, a line item in agricultural trade data rather than a subject of songs or scripture. It moves by the shipload now, from producers like Russia, France, Germany, Australia, and Canada, into feedlots and malt houses on nearly every continent, redistributed by a global trade network that barely bothers to advertise what it is shipping. Barley did not disappear. It just stopped being asked to take a bow. And yet, quietly, it has been staging a comeback in the one arena where it never actually lost relevance: the brewing kettle. The craft beer movement that exploded from a handful of American microbreweries in the 1970s and 80s into a global industry of tens of thousands of small producers has put malted barley back at the center of a cultural conversation. This time, framed not as subsistence food or state-controlled commodity, but as artisanal craft, terroir, and flavor profile. Distillers have followed suit, with single malt whiskey marketed on the specific provenance of its barley, the way wine is marketed on its grapes. The irony writes itself. The grain that spent centuries as peasant fare, animal feed, and prison ration is now sold at a premium precisely because of that humble pedigree. If you have found this history as strange as we have, consider what it says about how thoroughly a civilization can depend on something while managing to forget it entirely. Because that, in the end, is the real story here. Barley did not vanish so much as it was absorbed, distributed so widely and so invisibly across feed troughs, malt silos, and fermentation tanks that it became structurally indispensable and culturally irrelevant at exactly the same time. Go back to that opening question. How does a grain that once outranked wheat, that measured out wages and built empires, that filled Hammurabi's ration lists and fed Rome's legions, end up as a footnote on a cereal box or a line in a brewer's ingredient list? The answer is that it never stopped working. It just stopped getting credit. Every pint of beer, every dram of whiskey, every steak from a grain-fed animal carries a few thousand years of barley's fingerprints, whether anyone reads the label or not. So the next time you raise a glass, remember what is actually in it. Not just malted grain and water and yeast, but 10,000 years of ritual, currency, conquest, industry, and quiet, unglamorous persistence. Barley did not lose its empire. It just learned to rule from the shadows.